right, welcome back, everyone. It is, let's see, January 19th, 2022, and we are back for another Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. This week, we are really lucky to have a very exciting talk, and so I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then we'll get going. So João Henrique Fernandes Amaral is a postdoc working with Dr. Elise Morrison here in Environmental Engineering Sciences here at UF, and also in collaboration with Thomas Bianchi's lab in UF Geology or Geological Sciences, where he's investigating the production and transformation of phosphorus and organic matter in South Florida treatment wetlands. A lot of you are aware of those or worked in those. But before coming to UF, João was a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, in particular studying greenhouse gas dynamics in the Amazon floodplain system, where he's worked on this topic since 2008. João received his MS in freshwater biology and PhD in biology from the National Institute of Amazonian Research, so INPA in Brazil. And his research combines field measurements, observations, experiments, GIS tools and mapping, statistical models to answer questions at the ecosystem level and across different temporal and spatial scales. So I think today we'll mostly be hearing about the carbon cycle in Amazonian floodplains. And with that, João, the floor is yours. Please go ahead and share.
Thanks for the introduction, David. Let's put here the presentation. And are you all seeing my screen?
Looks perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's go to it. So today I'll be talking about the carbon dynamics in the Amazon floodplains and implications for the carbon cycle. I will start acknowledging my co-authors and the collaborators and the funding source for this project. And I will give a special call for Pedro Barbosa and João Miller that worked with me, the gas component of this work, Wing Chao and Sally McTarry and Alicia Cortez that work at the hydrodynamics and the physical process, and Thiago and Rodrigo Nunes that work up the herbáceous information, and also the founding agencies that founded that work. And so to start, we can really see in the figure of the Amazon basin, it's just outstanding that this is a large basin. So based on the magnitude of this basin, it's really, it makes that basin really relevant to the carbon cycle. And what we are showing here are different, it's a vegetation classification map of the vegetation in the wetlands of the Amazon. And these wetlands correspond to 17% of the whole Amazon basin. So huge area of wetlands and really diversity and heterogeneous. So we can highlight here big areas like these wetlands that are more dominated by wood vegetation, herbaceous plants, but today we'll be focused only in the floodplains along the main channel of the Amazon River. And this is a mosaic of open water areas, floodplain channels, and flooded forests and herbaceous plants. And another important aspect of the Amazon basin, it's the inundation dynamics. So these are figures from the Janauca floodplain system that I'll be talking today, just showing different moments of the hydrological cycle. And then we can see here in the low water period that the lake was mainly restricted to a small channel, and large areas of sediments were exposed. And then we can see that since the rising water period, when the water levels of the Solimões River starts to rise and flood the system, there is large changes in the environment and in the connection between these aquatic habitats. And this seasonal dynamics of the changes in the inundation are really important and related with precipitation patterns and the ice of the Andes Mountains. So these are all important aspects to understand the carbon cycle in this wetland basin. And going deeper on the carbon cycle, I will highlight the first study that made a regional estimation of the contribution of the aquatic habitats in the Amazon wetlands to the carbon cycle, to the regional carbon cycle. And that study combined measurements of CO2, water concentration at different areas of the basin along this quadrant, and used remote sensing to interpolate spatially these results. And they estimated that the aquatic habitats in the Amazon, they emit 500 teragrams of carbon per year, which is 10 to 12 grams of carbon. So a lot of carbon that is being emitted. And in that time, that estimate was comparable to the carbon that was fixed by the forest in this low basin, really pointing to the importance and the relevance of these wetlands to the regional carbon cycle. And after this first study, there were multiple studies that revisit that number. And what is really the message that I really want to capture today is that there are large uncertainties associated with these estimates. And that's what I will be focusing today on, better understanding those uncertainties and the source of variability on the greenhouse gas in these wetlands. So moving on the uncertainties, we have here different pictures showing the different aquatic habitats that we can find in this Amazon wetlands. So we have river systems, reservoirs, and floodplain lakes, and these are all open water habitats. And most of the work that was done previously on carbon dynamics in greenhouse gas was focused on the river systems and in the floodplain lakes. But we do have aquatic vegetation habitats like the herbaceous plants, which look really like a grass field, but these are actually floating grass in a floodplain lake, really common in these systems. And also we have flooded forests that we can see by this aerial view of the archipelago, Anavilhanas archipelago at the Negro River Basin. And from a flooded forest view, we can see from here this aquatic habitat, which is really the greater aquatic habitat that we have in the basin, that represents 80% of the total area of these wetlands. But this aquatic habitat is the least studied on gas studies. So there are really lack of information about some of these aquatic habitats, and also there are lack of information on the temporal dynamics. So we have some nice description on how CO2 mainly changes in a seasonal base, some moments on the hydrological cycle that we have information for methane as well. But we do really feel how the gas dynamics for CO2 and methane change over a 24-hour period in a dial basis, and also interannually. So based on that, our research group had this general question on how does the methane and carbon dioxide dynamics vary at multiple spatial and temporal scales in the Amazon basin. And today I'll be focused mainly on our contributions to the lack of information from these vegetated aquatic habitats and the variability that are associated with this gas dynamics over different temporal scales, the dial, seasonal, and interannual. So our study was done at the Janauacá floodplain system. It's a floodplain system located close to here is the city of Manaus, that is in the heart of the Amazon. We have here the Negro River Basin, the Negro River and the Solimões River that both form the Amazon River in front of the city of Manaus. And our system was located here associated with the Solimões River. In this view, we can see the Solimões River and the Janauacá floodplain basin. And in our study, we were mainly focused on understanding the difference associated with the aquatic habitats in this floodplain system, but also related to different exposure to the wind or to the vertical dimension of the water column. So that's why we choose the two regions in the floodplain lake, and that we call wind exposed or open lake, or wind protected or embayment region. And then we can have a better perspective of the Janauacá floodplain system. This is a drone footage that was taken during the low water period. So a period where the lake has got more isolated from the Solimões River. And we can see this region here, I will drive your attention to here. We can see there is a dense forest and an embayment. This is where we have our site, the wind protect site or the embayment site, with closer connection with the flooded forest and the microphytes in the system. And as the drone is moving here, we can see far in the horizon, this light green line of trees. This is actually the levee that separates this floodplain system to the Solimões River. And all that we can see here as light green are grasses that grew on sediments that were exposed during this low water period. And I can tell you that during the high water period, everything got flooded. So there is water everywhere in this system. And we can see here in the horizon, this light green areas as well. This is showing the open lake area. That's another region where we track down the changes in the gas dynamics in flooded forests, herbaceous plants, and open water areas. And this is showing here the floodplain channel that connects with the Solimões. So the system got flooded by overflow of that levee that I just showed and by inputs of water through that channel. And another important aspect is that we have people living in this floodplain. So we have houses showing here. And now that the drone will go up, it will show that in the southern portion of this floodplain system, there is a dense forest and forest streams that also contribute with organic carbon and water, different constructing water to the system. So it's a system that has this large inundation dynamics, and we can think about hydrodynamics in the carbon cycle, how we have different scenarios over a year in this lake. So our study focus on understanding better the difference between open water areas associated with or more exposed to the wind, as we can see by these features near the surface, that these areas are more turbulent or more susceptible to water column mixing, and the embayment site that I showed in the drone footage, that we can see really calm waters and more sheltered and protect from the wind. So these are ambients that are more conducive to thermal stratification, to a more stable water column structure related to temperature. And also we investigated inundated forests and herbaceous plants that were freezing these two open water areas. And we did this investigation for a period of 2 years, where we did multiple visits and to this flooded plain system. And these different shapes, they represent the occurrence or when the habitats that we investigated here were accessible. And to do our research, since we were focused on understanding the dial variability, there is no way of covering that without being the lake. So we used this traditional floating house as a research base, and where we spent lots of days over these 2 years in the system. So let's get back on. So since we want to understand the different temporal variations and how that impact the gas dynamics, let's think on what would change in over 24 hours in a system like this. So we have the sun, the dial cycle of sun that impact the photosynthesis, and since that we have that sun produce heat and cooling on the water column, we would expect a change in the thermal stratification on these lakes. So that's why we really focus on understanding better the mechanisms associated with these dial variations. And for that, we instrumentated our research base with a meteorological station. We deployed wind buoys in the open water areas. And we also measured the thermal structure of each of these aquatic habitats by installing thermistor arrays, thermistor chain. We distributed sensors of temperature and dissolved oxygen along the water column in these aquatic habitats. And we did some experiments that was led by Sally McIntyre, where she measured directly the turbulence and the microstructure on these aquatic habitats. And in parallel to that, we did multiple visits over the 24-hour period to measure gas profiles of methane and CO2, and also the diffusive flux during the day and during the night and in the different aquatic habitats. So that's how we covered the dynamics in the system. So with that, let's see some results on this research. And first of all, I will start with this table that brings an overview of the results. Oh my God, that's a lot of numbers. So hold on, I will guide you guys. Let's go with me. So I first would like to emphasize the concentration values among these different aquatic habitats. So it's really outstanding to us that the mean concentration measured at the herbaceous plants are for the CO2 are higher than the other aquatic systems, and the same for the methane. So herbaceous plants, they had higher water concentration. And another interesting result is that when we compare these two different open waters, the one that was more exposed to the wind and the one that was more sheltered and with more thermal stratification, we also see that the concentrations are greater in the site that had more stable stratification patterns. So we can see that methane is twice as higher in concentration at this site in comparison to that. So really important differences in gas concentrations. And also, I would like to raise your attention on the variability that we have in the fluxes, that CO2 varying over 2 orders of magnitude, methane on 2 orders of magnitude, even 3 orders of magnitude, the diffusive, the bubble flux, and the CO2 diffusive flux. So main messages from these tables are that both methane and CO2 concentration are higher at emergent vegetation habitats, especially these herbaceous plants, and that methane and carbon dioxide flux are highly variable in all aquatic habitats that we investigated in this study. And I will anticipate to you that this variability is associated with these different temporal scales, the seasonal, the diel, and the interannual, and we are going to get to there. So first of all, let's start talking about this result of the higher concentrations at the herbaceous plants. So emergent vegetation, what is really important and to have on mind is that in a perspective of the Amazon basin, they are the main primary producers. So 90% of the primary production is attributed to the flooded forest in the herbaceous plants. And what they are doing, they have their leaves out of the water. So they are uptaking CO2 from the atmosphere, and the organic carbon that they produce, it's microbially processed in the water system. So there is an excess of CO2 and methane that is produced due to the decay of this organic carbon that they input to the aquatic system, but also during a daily basis, in the daily photosynthesis process, they contribute with CO2 through their roots that are inundated. So their roots are underwater, and as an effect of the metabolism of these plants, they contribute with CO2 to the water, and that's why we have an excess of CO2 in the water in relation to the atmosphere. The waters in the Amazon and other inland waters are generally super saturated in CO2. And this CO2 is also being evaded by these aquatic habitats and integrated in regional models. But what is really interesting that was astonishing on our study was the dynamics that we saw in these herbaceous plants. So only because we had meteorological information and detailed information on the temperature and the dissolved oxygen changes in the water column under these aquatic habitats, that really showed us complex biological dynamics and in complex physical dynamics over a period of 24 hours. So I will guide you guys on those panels that I bring in here. So this in the left is the herbaceous plants information, and in the right is the open water information on the same site, in the wind protect site. So what is really cool to see here, in this middle panel here, we have CO2 concentrations in this color panel and dissolved oxygen in this bottom panel. So we can see here, photosynthesis, it's the sunlight is on. And so these floating grasses, they have their leaves out of the water, and their root zone is usually located, distributed on the first first meter of up down to 1.5 meters. So their roots are on this edge. And we can see here the huge increase in CO2 concentrations associated with the sunset, which is the photosynthetic process of these herbaceous plants. Another cool thing to see is that we see really high oxygen concentrations near the surface on this environment. And these are associated with the periphytic algae that is associated with these roots of these plants and close to the surface. So there is planktonic and periphytic algae photosynthesis going on. And that's why you see these big DO increments in these herbaceous plants as well. But what is even cooler is to see how dramatic are the changes in the temperature at these sites in relation to the open water. So temperatures can go as high as 38 degrees on these herbaceous plants. And as soon as we start to see the sun starts to set and we start to see reductions in the air temperature, these systems starts to, there is a fast heat loss that occurs, and that has a huge impact on changing the density of the water. So we know that cooler waters are denser. So when they start to lose heat to the atmosphere, we can see this process of vertical movement. These oxygen-enriched waters, they actually sink because of the temperature difference in density gradients associated with the cooling process. And why is this important? If we look at here on the same figures on the open water side, this increment in the CO2 that we see here over the 3 meters is actually CO2 from this aquatic habitat that was advected to the open waters. And that, in a 24-hour basis, cause really complex hydrodynamic changes, and that can affect the gas fluxes as well. So what we are really seeing is that these herbaceous plants are acting as source of enriched CO2 waters to the open waters. So really cool process that we were able to describe in this investigation. And even cooler is that the postdoc Wing Chai Zhu, he was able to model that, to reproduce the physical features associated with these dynamics that I just described. So this is a simulation showing the differential heating between the microphytes and the open water. And he used a tracer that we can name this tracer as delta CO2 concentrations. And we can see these dynamics of CO2 enriched water being advected to the open water. So really cool dynamic that we described in this study that was published last year in Ecosystems. And Wing Chao is working on a manuscript on the 3D hydrodynamic models that cover these physical features. So let's move on to the temporal variations. So as we already showed the importance of these herbaceous plants and the concentrations in these sites and over a diol season, let's go deeper on the diol changes and the impacts of that. So here I'm bringing results from the flooded forest associated with this exposed, and comparisons between the flooded forest sites associated with the exposed open water and the protected water for the wind. And we had that question of, its night flux is greater than daily flux. So let's compare for a given campaign, the flux measured during the night with the fluxes measured during the day. And we can see that for the wind exposed site, most of the points, they fall along this 1:1 line, except on these 2 occasions. But for the wind protected site, we see that there are higher CO2 flux during the day in comparison to the night. And what really changed in a diol basins in this system? We can see that the wind was an important feature in the system, and there is more variable wind during the night at this site, and more variable wind speeds measured during the day. And that's actually, if you think that it's a really stable water column, really well concentrated in CO2, any disturbance that the wind can cause near the surface would enhance the diffusive flux. And that's why we saw higher diffusive flux in the wind protected during the day. And also, we are talking about forests, so you think, okay, that's forests are sheltered by nature from the wind. But since we have these measurements of winds, they were done in an open water associated with those forests. And what Sally described on a paper, Sally McIntyre described on a paper that she published in 2019, was that the wind was causing shear and advective flow to this forest that were impacting the flux that we measured under those canopies. So an important result that we published as well. And this is just showing again the importance of this physical process. We can see here that during the day there is a large intensive stratification going on. And by the spread of these isotherms, we can see that there was cooling occurring. And we can see this pattern here, higher fluxes during the high water and lower flux during low water. And the lower fluxes during low water is because the lakes got isolated from this emergent vegetation, more internal process, planktonic primary production goes on, and they highly impact the primary production and the fluxes and concentrations in the site. So higher concentrations during the high water associated with the inundation of the associated vegetation and all the contributions that we already seen that is important from this vegetation. But for the methane, it was really interesting to see that the dynamic, the seasonal dynamic was the opposite. We saw that the methane emissions were greater during the low water period. And that's really counterintuitive because the water will be really oxygenated. And how can be more methane since we have deeper water column during the high water period that is more conducive to the methane production? How that can be? So what is really happening is that these systems are completely mixing during the low water period because they are really shallow, 1 meter, 2 meters of water column that we are talking here. And the methane, there's being oxygen onto the bottom, but the sediments go deeper and the methane got produced on these deeper layers. And what is really happening is that the methane has more, has a better opportunity to being evaded, because what we saw in a study that was led by Pedro Barbosa is that he measured the methane oxidation rates in the systems. And we can see a representation in these figures here that there is the traditional pattern of decrease in dissolved oxygen concentrations with depth, and this line is marking the hypoliminal, and this is marking the increments in the concentrations of methane with depth as well. And these bars, the white bars in these graphs, are showing methane oxidation rates. So we have higher rates associated with higher concentrations. And in this work, he had like almost a 1-for-1 relation on methane oxidation rates with methane concentrations. So what's really happening during the high water period, when we have more conditions to produce methane oxidation is playing a big role on offsetting the methane emissions in the system. So that's why we explain this seasonal dynamics. And getting back to the seasonal, we can see that the nice pattern for CO2, but let's take a look on the seasonal patterns that we found on the wind protected site. And we can see that in the second year of our study, there was higher concentrations of CO2 during the low water and the rising water period in comparison to the first year. So what happened that year? And that comes another dimension, the internal variability importance to explain the gas dynamics in the systems. So during the first year was really common, these floating grass. We already saw the importance of them to explain and as source of gas for these systems. But during the low water period in October 2015, what we saw is a really intensive drought. So the lake Janauacá, all the macrophytes that were associated with this open water the lake drought and they decay, and there was increment in the concentration during this low water period associated with the decay of these macrophytes that were abundant in the system. And okay, so these macrophytes are really fast. So if the sediments were exposed, what we see, they were completely covered by a rooted grass. And we can see a Landsat image here in December, the lake was all green. And since we are in a system that has a predictable change in the inundations, since the water levels starts to rise and the Solimões River starts to flood this system, all that macrophyte, the rooted macrophyte that grew in the sediments, die off and decay. And that's why we have in February and January really high concentrations of CO2 and explaining these interannual differences. And what was really cool is that I told you that there are people living in these lakes. So what we observed is there was a lot of fire associated with the crops that people, and actually our study site in the embayment, there was a portion of it that that had fire as well. And we didn't, as a consequence of that, we didn't see that herbaceous floating grass that was really abundant during the first year occurring during the second year. And we can see here that the changes in the CO2 concentrations that were during the high water and the falling water period, when these macrophytes were absent, they were lower in comparison to the first year. So really showing the importance of this aquatic vegetation dynamics on impacting on the CO2 dynamics in here. But one can make a call, okay, but let's think about the impact of this extended drought period. And what I mean by extended drought period, we can compare here the low water levels of both years that we investigated. And we can see here, this was the low water level. And we persisted on that lower level condition for almost 3 to 4 months. So it was an extended drought period. And what happened? We can see the CO2 fluxes here, as I've showed that they increased, especially in January, in comparison to the previous January. And one can make a call, okay, that is just CO2 that was fixed and converted into biomass from these macrophytes, and they decayed and returned to the atmosphere, so no problem at all. Although, if that carbon biomass is converted to methane, and since methane it has a 40 times the sustained global warming potential for CO2, then we have a debalance on the carbon cycle. So if we, during these extended drought periods, if we are incrementing the emissions of methane through macrophyte decomposition, we have a debalance. And I did this calculation on methane flux as CO2 equivalents, and we can see that effect. In comparison to the previous year, there was increments during the low water and the early rising water in January for this CO2 equivalent flux. So a debalance that can be associated with this extended drought period. And so going through the implications of our results to the methane and carbon dioxide dynamics to the carbon cycle, we can stress out that this extended drought period is actually being what will be the scenario for the central Amazon. That this paper led by Sorribas is showing that the central Amazon basin would, due to the reductions in the precipitation and in the discharge of the Solimões River, it's expected that the inundation extent will be lower and the season will be shallower. Conditions that we saw during this extended drought period. So this is an important implication for future climate change for these floodplains. And also the fact that methane oxidation was important to offset these aquatic emissions was really cool. And there is an impact on the regional carbon estimate that deserves more attention on that process as well. And finally, another implication from our results is that we were, for the first time, we accessed flooded forest sites in a comprehensive manner. And we found out that there yes, they emit much less CO2 and methane in comparison to the open water areas. But since they have a larger area in the basin, they contribute significantly to the outgassing from the basin. And actually these results, they base their revised bottom up estimates for the basin. So that was the scenario that we had since the first regional estimate, that the contribution of the aquatic habitats in the Amazon, they were always increasing. And this is mainly because different authors add more information on the open water sites, and we do see and we corroborate these results, seeing that these are areas more conducive to emissions, but they are extrapolated, especially without considering that the main aquatic habitat in the Amazon was flooded forests, and the conditions in those canopies are different. So this is like a summary of the estimates that we have for the basin now. There was published in this chapter on the science panel for the Amazon last year. And we can see that the flooded forests are the aquatic habitat that contributes the most with both carbon dioxide and methane to the regional estimates from these different aquatic habitats in the Amazon basin. So, and also there's been recent evidence of the importance of these flooded forests as well by their tree fluxes for methane especially, and which is comparable to the aquatic emissions for methane. And with that, I will finish with the take-home message that I would give you guys today. So based on these two guidances that we have on the lack of information from these vegetated aquatic habitats and the variabilities that were associated with the gas dynamics in different temporal scales, our results really show that the dynamics of these aquatic habitats, especially the vegetation, they largely influence the carbon dioxide and the methane fluxes and concentrations at multiple temporal scales. We saw that physical processes, they really play an important role on carbon dioxide and methane dynamics, especially at diacycles. And biological processes like photosynthesis and heterotrophic activity of the microbes associated with the decay of this labile carbon, and the consume of the methane by the methane oxidation, they impact these gas dynamics as well. And in our studies really showing the relevance of combining these gas measurements with meteorological and limnological information to better understand the carbon dioxide and methane dynamics in these wetlands. And finally, that the carbon studies in aquatic habitats of wetlands, they should integrate their carbon fluxes by weighting their relative area coverage in the floodplain, so to correctly interpolate these results. With that, I will take your questions. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be talking here today. And I will take your question. Thank you.
Thank you, João, very much. And so everyone, please give a round of applause to Dr. Amaral, either real life or Zoom applause. Very much appreciate it. You took us very deeply on a journey from like daily variation all the way through interannual. And I think, your last point about incorporating the biological measurements with the limnological and meteorological was really, really cool and led to some surprising, sort of outcomes, like the idea that drought was causing a methane flux increase, which I think, all the sort of aquatic and wetland biogeochemists would, like you said, scratch their heads at first and try to understand that. So really important outcomes. So let's open it up to the room for questions. And anyone in Zoom have a question? I'm going to go check the YouTube real quick. Well, I'm going to get this process seeded a little bit, João. So, and maybe from a student point of view, and just sort of an idea, the idea that certainly production, either above water, so emergent or in water production, biological production, so the fixing of carbon, then leads to microbial degradation either through aerobic respiration or methanogenesis or any one of the organic matter decomposition. That makes sense to me as a source for either CO2 or methane flux from the water column. But you also mentioned something about sort of like this direct pass through, the CO2 uptake with roots in the water column or roots in the inundated soil being a sort of direct pump of CO2 to the water. And personally, I'm less familiar with that process. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or whether you think that is an important part of the flux, or is it really more about the microbial degradation flux?
Yeah, I would say that it's both. That the roots are, as we saw on those colored figures, was really outstanding. That the CO2 was increasing a lot in the layers associated with the roots, and this is because the plants were photosynthesizing and respiring at the same time. It's the same thing as we do.
Okay, got you. From respiration, from plant root respiration.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so that's the main mechanism of there is inputs of CO2 associated with the respiration of the plants as well. But I really want to acknowledge that microbial process, and there are a bunch of work that was done evaluating how fast carbon can be degraded in these systems. There's priming evidence, and also especially these herbaceous plants, they have really light biocarbon that is happily converted into CO2 from microbes. Yeah, so both processes acting together.
Thanks. We have a question from the class. So Brady asked, what are the potential public policy consequences from this research? Obviously, you were very much deeply into like the meter scale or sub-meter scale hydrodynamics, right? And how are you going to sort of scale this type of ideas up to policy relevance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's an exercise that us as scientists have to be doing constantly. And I have thought about that before. And what I really think that how we can connect that is that there are being recent evidence that this basin is changing due to climate change as well. So deforestation, the occurrence of fire in the basin, it's really changing how these forests are acting as a source or as a sink of carbon in the basin. So I really would go into policies on trying to drive more management controls on the fire, manage firing in this floodplain system, and really controlling the deforestation in this area, because we have some environmental laws that were recently revised, and there is no law framework to contemplate the forests associated with these areas that are susceptible to inundation. So something that we really need to connect with and turn into policies, I would say.
Thanks, João. We have a question from Danielle Casper from YouTube. Excellent presentation. And sorry, she mentions that Suribas et al. Said that some regions in the Amazon will have larger flooded areas, like in the Western Amazon. So what do you think you were going to see from emissions of CO2 and methane in the regions that have enhanced flooding?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really, really good point. And so yeah, the enhanced flooding, what the previous work that was done in the Amazon and for the CO2 is really showing that if you increase inundation and carbon inputs in the system, we would have greater emissions. So under this scenario, for the CO2, I would expect increments in the emission associated with it.
Okay, and I think, we must have let Thomas Bianchi into the YouTube. He's got a question for you, so you know him well. He asked, why is the carbon dioxide export from the wetlands in the bottom waters? What controls that? Why is the CO2 export from the wetland in bottom waters?
What is that? So I think I got it. It's we saw that there is this really large stratification patterns, and there is a lot of organic matter inputs in the system, and this can be trapped in the sediment. So the sediments is a really important source of CO2 to the water column as well. And this is actually a component that we didn't look at on our study, and it's really important as a source of CO2 to the water column as well. So I would say that the sediments, and especially under these stratified conditions, really important on producing CO2 as well from anaerobic and aerobic process.
Okay. I have another question, but anyone else from Zoom or in the conference room over there? Brady, you have another question? No? All right, so I wanted that last point you made about doing aerial, like using the aerial coverage of the different ecosystems to predict the overall fluxes, I think was really obviously very important, but maybe help me understand all of the gas flux measurements and CO2 concentration measurements that you present were from water column samples, is that correct?
Yes, the water column, you're right.
Yeah. So I kept wondering about this large, variation in inundation pattern. And so during the period of time that the grass system or even the floodplain forests are not inundated, they're also serving as a flux. And potentially, it's highly oxygenated, so mostly CO2, less methane. But I may have missed it, but is the gas flux from the non-inundated portions of floodplain, like the time and the space over which they're non-inundated, incorporated into that measure of overall, CO2 and methane flux?
That's a really good question, David. And this is something that we are really precautions on deriving annual estimates, because for example, the flooded forests, there are really few studies that measure what were the emissions on those soils when they were dry and were not flooded. So I really see that as a really important and another uncertainty point that should be better addressed in the basin. In our study, we were only looking at the water, but you're right, that needs to be considered as well. And there are really few studies to put this into account, as well as the net primary production, right? Because to really evaluate the
Right.
effect of this, we need to know how much is being produced by this emergent vegetation to compensate it.
All right, thank you. And it looks like Bruce Forsberg also had the same question about the wetlands when they're dry. So we shared our idea about that. So João, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving our seminar this week. And for all the students, we'll see you again the same time, same place. Make sure to get your one-page write-ups in from the last week as well as this week. And if you have any questions, email myself or Dr. Clark.
Yeah.
Let's give another round of applause to João. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for all attending to this.
Really awesome work. Looking forward.